La primera conferencia que vamos a tener hoy es la del profesor Tim Devoogd. Tim recibió su doctorado en la Universidad de Illinois en neurociencias. Él tuvo una pasantía postdoctoral en la Universidad de Rockefeller y después se vinculó con el Departamento de Psicología de la Universidad de Cornell, donde ha permanecido desde entonces. Él y sus estudiantes han investigado sobre la neurobiología del aprendizaje. Ellos han estudiado cómo, por ejemplo, el aprendizaje de las aves. Él tuvo un sabático en la Universidad de Oxford, uno en la Universidad de Cape Town y en la Universidad Nacional de Singapur. Hace 6 años recibió el fellowship del Jefferson Science y trabajó un año en el Departamento de Estado de los Estados Unidos, donde estuvo trabajando en la oficina del hemisferio del Western Hemisphere y asesorando particularmente en políticas sobre América Latina. Él dedicó un semestre a enseñanza sobre estudios americanos en la Universidad de los Andes y en la Universidad Nacional. Hoy en día es el director de la Universidad de Cornell para estudios latinoamericanos y trabaja muy fuertemente para generar lazos científicos entre la Universidad de Cornell y América Latina. Entonces, los dejo en manos del profesor Devoogd.
Buenos días a todos. Solo puedo hablar un poco en español. La conferencia va a ser en inglés, lo siento. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming early in the morning. Thank you to Dr. Sarama for organizing this, and thank you to the administration of the National University for helping to support this. As you heard in the introduction, I've been involved now for several years in trying to build ties in science between the United States and Latin America, and more recently between my university and Latin America. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm not going to talk about the neuroscience work that I've done, although I'm happy to. I think I have done some interesting things. I'm rather going to talk more about the intersection between science and social movements, between science and different peoples coming together. The first question I asked when Dr. Sarama asked me to participate in this, the first question I asked is, why me? I don't have the experience or influence of Dr. Mocus, whom you're soon going to hear. I'm an outsider. I'm not Colombiano. I have little understanding of how things work or don't work in Colombia. And Dr. Sarama pushed me and said, no, we want you. And so I tried to think of reasons. Well, the reasons I come up with are that I've been a scientist for 40 years. I've worked in major universities in 5 continents. And in recent years, I've had hundreds of conversations with senior educators, scientists, and government officials throughout this hemisphere. And of course, I love Colombia. So I believe that Colombia has the physical and human resources to achieve development for all of its citizens without degrading the country or without compromising its values in the process. I also believe that this will involve science working with society, a mix that has all the complexity and all the uncertainty described in the introduction to the course. So I'm not going to talk to you about the physics of chaos and complex systems. You'll hear more about that. You've heard about that already. But it certainly does apply to different groups of people coming together and trying to make decisions and carry them out. And I believe that approaches to science that were devised in the United States will make success more likely. It's easy for people in the United States. I expect it's even easy for people like yourselves, who most of whom are young, to forget how far Latin America has traveled in the last 25 or 30 years. Do you recognize the three faces? One of them is still present. If we look back 30 years ago, across the hemisphere, there were some countries like Mexico and Cuba that had had one-party rule. There were countries, many countries, had military dictatorships. There were countries that had civil wars going on. There were countries like Colombia in which the FARC and the drug traffickers were making trouble. It was pretty grim. And if at the time there were incompetent governments throughout the hemisphere, there was corruption, there was inflation, high rates of poverty, high rates of difference between the people who were rich and the people who were poor. Many countries did not have any kind of coherent development plan, and the United States in the North would ignore the whole thing except when there were problems. And the typical solution to problems was to send weapons or to send soldiers. If we look across Latin America today, of course there are still problems. Of course each of the things I've mentioned is still present to some degree, but there are democratic governments. There is an emphasis on development. There is an emphasis throughout the hemisphere on education. There is a wish in many countries, and maybe especially in Colombia, to be innovators and creators, not just suppliers of commodities and raw materials. There's a wish to be partners with the United States and not just supplicants. Of course, there's a lot of variation across the region, but it's an incredibly exciting time. As I travel to various countries in Latin America, I see many countries that are more aligned with U.S. aims and values, sometimes even more so than the U.S. is itself. But deep misunderstandings remain. For example, of course, there are the vestiges of United States imperialism like Guantanamo. There's still the Cuba embargo, although relations are warming in many respects with Cuba. There's the war on drugs, where U.S. money goes to fight drugs, but U.S. money is also what pays for the drugs. There's free movements of goods between many countries, but not free movement of labor. And something that has been interesting and in some ways a surprise to me, you can find that people in different countries have a very profound differences in their understanding of history. And I just have a tiny illustration of this. In the United States, each of the branches of the armed services has a song or a hymn that's associated with it. The United States Marines, of course, have a song that's called the Marine Hymn. One of the lines in the Marine Hymn is, "From the halls of Montezuma." How many people here know what that's talking about? Anyone? From the halls of Montezuma? The next line goes, "To the shores of Tripoli. We will fight our country's battles on the land and on the sea." Halls of Montezuma? Okay. Another question. Who were the Niños Héroes and how did they die? Anybody know the answer to that? Are you from Mexico?
No, I'm not from Mexico, but I visit there, so I know. They were fighting, and they were the heroes at some point in the history. I really don't know the exact point, but what I know is that the subway has a metro station with that.
Okay, there is a subway station. There are many monuments to the Niños Héroes in Mexico. I didn't expect you necessarily to know about either one of these. If I were to ask the question in Mexico, though, almost no one would know the answer to the first question. Almost everyone would know the answer to the second. And the point that I want to make here is that they refer to the same thing. This is United States soldiers in one of our wars with Mexico going and conquering the Castle of Montezuma, the castle that was on the heights that were called the Heights of Montezuma, back in the early 1800s. United States Marines landing and climbing up the hillside, going to the castle, and having a great victory. These are the Niños Héroes who did not receive the word that General Santa Anna had decided to leave the hill. They were students, secondary students at a military academy. They were the only ones left to fight against the United States Marines. Francisco Marquez was 14 years old. He was one of the first to die. Juan Escutia was one of the last to die. He wrapped himself in the Mexican flag and jumped off the cliff. The very same event, a very different understanding, depending on who you ask. That colors relations between the United States and Latin America in many ways. And how do you get beyond that? I'm going to suggest to you that scientific research and use of scientific discoveries is one of the ways. But first, I think we have to understand some hard truths. These are things that we all know, but don't often talk about in a context like this. So with Colombia, there are problems, of course. Education is poor, especially in public schools. Universities here do not have high rankings on the world markers of universities. Industry puts too little money into research and development. Too often, in this country and in other countries of Latin America, industry and the universities don't talk. There are large areas of Colombia that have been lawless or have been influenced by the FARC and by the narco-traffickers. Many people in this country have been displaced. Many have moved into the big cities, creating problems both out in the land and in the cities. And many people still make their livings on very tiny farms where they're unable to ever escape being poor. So if these are the real problems, how do we go about addressing them? How do we go about making things better? Well, here's some illustrations. I'll go through this quickly. I'm sure you know this, that in the description, in the PISA scores of how high school students do in mathematics, the United States is not very good. We're way down on the left-hand side there. But countries in Latin America are far, far further down. It's not very good. If we look at the Shanghai rankings of universities, the best universities in the region rank fairly lowly on this compared to, of course, the schools that are at the top. And if we think about the relations between industry and the universities, a relation that has been highly productive in the United States, in many countries of Latin America, and I think in Colombia, they don't talk to each other. They have differences in points of view. If we look at the university people and how they view the heads of industry, they see the heads of industry as often as being privileged, as being selfish people only interested in money. And if you look at how the heads of industry view the universities, they see the universities as being full of troublemakers, people who are only interested in arguing, not in solving real problems. True? We can also look at how these two groups see themselves, how the people in the university see themselves, how the people in industry see themselves. I think it's like this, where both of them see themselves as creative, hardworking, building a better future for the nation. And so part of the challenge that we face in looking at how to bring these communities together is in communication, is in beginning to talk to each other about sharing common ideals and a common hope for what can happen in the country. How do we do it? How do we achieve progress? Well, I'm an outsider, I'm a North American, but these are some of the ideas I have. We recognize the hard truths first. We don't just push them aside. We recognize as well the strengths and assets that a country like Colombia has. And there are incredible strengths and assets here. We find common ground and cooperate, both within the country, for example, between government and industry and the universities, and between countries. And I believe science can provide a common language to do this. I believe that doing good science within and across borders both solves important problems and can lead to understanding between communities, what has been called science diplomacy. So, what are some of the strengths? Well, clearly, a huge number of tangible assets, like the mineral reserves, the oil, the variety of climates and ecosystems that make up Colombia, access to the Atlantic and Pacific, the potential for vast biological discoveries, incredible assets. And equally impressive are the intangible assets, like a stable government, a huge number of highly intelligent, motivated, hardworking people in their 20s and 30s. We could call this an army for prosperity. There's a commitment here in the country to sustainable growth. And at the city level, at the department level, and even at the national level, there are many idealistic leaders who are trying to move in these directions. What I'd like to do is give you a 5-minute summary of the materials that I presented in a course here several years ago. I think that the approaches to science that the US devised in World War II, they were born of necessity. The United States had to make discoveries quickly for the war, but we have found since that they've been incredibly valuable in making discoveries, making gains that led to sustained growth of the United States, improvements of standard of living, and improvements of United States status in the world. I think that those principles we came up with are ones that could catalyze similar huge strides in the standard of living in Latin America. And so I'm going to present some characteristics of the US system and suggest one practical example in which these approaches could be used here in Colombia. So, I'm going to go through this very quickly. I hope that the presentation will be available to those of you who are students in the course so that you can look at it in more detail later on. In the United States, our Congress allocates money to the agencies that conduct research or award research grants. And ideally, Congress does this without meddling. Ideally, it does it without specifying or mandating the content of the research. So the way that research gets done in the United States is individual scientists write grants and send them in. The individual scientists decide what it is that they want to study. They decide what the approaches are. They decide what kinds of discoveries they want to make. It's chaotic. Thousands and thousands of these proposals come in to the National Science Foundation, to the National Institutes of Health, to NASA, to the Department of Agriculture. It's chaotic. And it stands in contrast to a much more regulated system that happens in Western Europe. Then there is peer review of these proposals. Other scientists from the same discipline read the grants, and they make a commentary on the quality of the ideas and the ability of the scientist who's proposing this to carry out the research. They give a score, a mark, and you can look at it as a mark on a scale that goes from 0 to 100, where 0 is a perfect score and 100 is a very bad score. If you're up at a score that's below, say, 15, you'll get the money. If your score between 15 and 25, you might get the money. If your score is over 25, you won't get the money. So the grants then are allocated completely by merit. And sometimes Congress gets angry about this because they say, why is all this grant money going to Harvard and to MIT and to Cornell? Why isn't some of the money coming to my state, to Arkansas or Mississippi or other poor places? The answer is because good proposals don't come from those places. So there's a tension between what the Congress wants to have the money distributed all the way around and the merit-based system of saying, no, it goes to the highest score. That's the way it is. I think you face the same tension here. I think that the best universities, the highest, the most productive universities are here in Bogotá, in Medellin, in Cali, maybe in a few other places, but they're not in Cauca. And so what do you do then if you have money from the regalias? Do you send it to the best universities or do you send it to each of the departments? I think that the government made a decision that's sort of in between. They said, we'll send it to the departments, but the departments have to propose something that's really good. We'll see if it works. One of the things that's really critical about the US system, and this is something that's not found in most countries in Latin America, one of the things that's critical is that not only is money given to the researcher for research, there is another category of money called indirect costs that is given to the university. So for example, if I get a grant from the National Science Foundation, for every dollar that I get for working on a microscope, 50 cents more goes to my university. And many countries say, well, we can't afford that. That means extra money that we don't have. It's the most we can do to give a little bit of money to the researchers. I think it's critically important because that source of funding is what builds the labs, what builds the libraries, what pays for the journal subscriptions, things that many, many countries in Latin America are lacking. How do you do those things? You can give some money to a researcher, but if he or she is at a university in Ecuador, what good does it do to have $20,000 if there's no laboratory to carry out the research? Also, that means that at Cornell, where I'm employed, I'm expected to teach. I'm expected to spend 50% of my time on teaching and 50% of my time on research. It is because of the indirect costs coming to the university that gives that extra time for me to focus on research. And I think that at many universities in Latin America, the amount of teaching that the professors have to do is so much that it's difficult to do research. The people who do it in the evenings, do it on weekends, and end up with very hard lives because of that. Another quality of the US system is transparency. For the grants, there's transparency in the rules for applying. There's transparency in how you will be evaluated. There's transparency in who gets the money. And there's transparency in who the committees are along the way that make the decisions. All of this is public knowledge. In many countries of Latin America, it's not. Yes, there might be a grant system, but people might not ever be completely sure whether somebody got the money because he or she was the best scientist or because he or she was the cousin of the Minister of Education. A quality of the US system is public knowledge. Successful grant proposals are public. Everyone can read what was written and can see why it was that the committee thought that it was worth funding. And the agencies that provide the data mandate that the agencies that provide the money mandate that the data must be made public. Scientists have to publish their results. They can't just do a study and think about it. And there is a strong emphasis in the US that the general public has provided the money, the general public must finally know the results. And then something that has proven very, very successful in the US, a clear procedure for transferring knowledge from the university to industry. So, yes, the government pays for the research, but the research then is owned by the university and the investigator who make the discoveries. In many countries in Latin America, that's a problem, where governments say, we paid for it, so therefore it's ours. And this then takes away the incentive for the university and for the investigator to produce results that can actually be turned into a product or turned into a procedure that makes money. In the US, there's a rapid and reliable patent system so that if you make a new discovery, you can claim ownership to it and retain rights to it. And there's a mechanism for protection of intellectual property and fair distribution of the royalties that result, so that even the investigator who makes the discovery makes some of the money. And I understand that this is something that has been changing recently within Colombia, that there is a new law going into effect which will protect intellectual property in a way that was better than the past, and that this is something that Colombia too has recognized is important for scientific progress here. Something else that happens in the US, and I don't know what the status is here, if a big company, IBM or General Electric, invests in research and development, that investment comes off of its taxes. It does not have to pay taxes on that. That provides an incentive then to take some of the money that might go for taxes and to spend it on research and development instead. Again, that's something that could be used by many governments in Latin America. And lastly, there's a mechanism for oversight and regulation so that in any system, there's the possibility of waste, the possibility of fraud. And within the United States, there is an agency that's charged with looking for that and investigating and doing something about it. So I want to switch gears a little bit. I wanted to ask you another question. I wanted to know whether any of you here had read, I have 2 press releases, and I wanted to know whether any of you had read this either in English or in Spanish. Secretary of State John Kerry and National Science Foundation Director Subhra Suresh today announced a foreign policy initiative designed to build science and technology in Latin America and strengthen ties between the US and this region. Details are still being negotiated with governments from the region. However, the program is believed to contain financing for junior scientists in Latin America to work in US labs for 3 to 6 months, and for Latin American university students in the sciences to spend a semester taking science courses at US colleges and universities. How many of you read that? Read about that? You didn't. Has anyone seen this one? White House sources indicate that President Obama has agreed to the request he received from President Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia at the Summit of the Americas for a review of the uses of US aid provided under Plan Colombia, which will be $280 million in 2015. According to the White House official, Santos has asked that 1/3 of the funds provided for drug interdiction and eradication be assigned instead to education, including construction of new universities in the regions of Colombia in which much of the cocaine is produced. How many of you read about that? The bad news is that I invented those. I wish those were true. But the United States government is unlikely to create major new programs linking science in the 2 countries. The United States government tends to focus on places that have crises. We're focused on Iran, we're focused on Iraq, we're focused on Afghanistan. And sadly, only pays attention to places that have problems. However, it is certainly possible for the government of President Santos to approach the US and suggest this. And I could have a whole hour's discussion of why I think these 2 initiatives would be wonderful ideas. But it will require not the two presidents just getting together and talking about this. It will require people like ourselves trying to persuade them that they should do it. This is what that money actually gets used for. So the Plan Colombia money, much of it, the largest amount goes to anti-narcotics, which can include providing training, providing weapons to the Colombian armed forces, doing military training, a whole bunch of things related to the army. If you go and look at things that are related to national development and to science, like adapting to climate change, things that are directly related to science and technology, to biodiversity, to clean energy, this aid is not going into that. Almost not at all. And so then it becomes the responsibility of Colombia to negotiate with the US about that money, or the responsibility of Colombia to say, we don't care that the United States is focused on military things. These are things that are important to do for ourselves. The good news is that there are partners for this in the United States universities. United States universities and scientists are highly decentralized, which can be frustrating to deal with, but it offers immense opportunities. So individuals and entire universities now are eager to build collaborations and to make intelligent partnerships. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I'm here, representing my university in pursuing those kinds of agreements. If we take this view of the science practice in the US that has been so successful, what then, and then start to look at Colombia, what then are the kinds of things that Colombia should do to build a system that works in a similar way? Well, one, of course, as I mentioned, is indirect costs. Another is tax issues to make research and development more likely for industry here. Another is strengthening the patent process. And another is one that I've suggested a couple of times, and the people I've talked to never get as excited as me about it, which is to build a peer review system that goes across national boundaries. To have groups that review grant proposals from Colombia and Panama and Costa Rica and Venezuela all together, so that then there would be the experts, more experts coming together on tropical ecology from Costa Rica, on ways of using oil or other natural resources from Venezuela. Who knows who the experts might be, but to have a transnational group of doing the reviewing as a way of getting a better evaluation of what's truly innovative. I'd like to suggest that Colombia propose a joint US-Colombia fund for collaborative research. So Colciencias and the National Science Foundation each contribute some money, and they say that in order to get the money, it has to be both a Colombian scientist and a US scientist working together. Just a little bit of a side note. If I'm doing something at Cornell, and if I want students to come and participate, I always advertise that there's food. If you come up with an idea of things that would work better in Colombia, and you want to create an incentive for it to happen, provide a little money. It's the same principle. I think it would be wonderful I think it would be wonderful for ministries within Colombia to create programs that provide funds, but only if there's cooperation between researchers at universities and industry. Again, if there's a bit of money to start the process of collaboration, I think it'll take off and go a long way. There are things that are commonly done in the US that are very uncommon here, like using entrepreneurs and alumni networks. How many thousands of people have graduated from La Nacional? Tens of thousands. And how often does Nacional go to them and say, could you help us by giving a lecture on something on which you're the expert? Could you help us by giving us advice on how to build your faculty to be stronger? Could you give us money? It just doesn't happen in Latin America in the same way it does in the US. What I've heard many times in traveling the region is that this won't work here. We're not a science culture. We're a culture that's attuned to law, to literature. And so, yes, you can try very hard, but it's just our culture. It doesn't work. I think the people who say that are wrong. I gave a talk at Maloca, the Science Museum, several years ago, and there were about, 150, 200 kids in the room who were completely fascinated with my talking about the brain. Those were kids who could be the next generation's neuroscientists if they have the opportunities. I was taken to a lab facility in the south of Bogotá. I think it's run by SENA, where there were students, high school students, from the poor communities nearby who were given advanced instruments to work with, both with engineering and with microbiology. Those students were fascinated. Those students were driven to produce excellent results from the things they were working on. I heard a story that people from the US Embassy, that there had been a delegation there recently of some senior people from industry in Colombia. And one of the heads of a company in Colombia was very impressed at what excellent work these students were doing. And as he was leaving the building, he said, "You guys are doing such a wonderful job. I'm really looking forward to being able to hire these graduates when they leave here." And after he went out the door, one of the students said, "I don't want to work for him. I want to own his company." There is the potential out there, and the potential is not limited by socioeconomic class. It's not limited to the people who have been the families that have influenced politics in Colombia for many years. It's a huge amount of potential that so far has not really been taken advantage of. So some of the programs that I've heard about, I think, are truly outstanding here. The Regalias program for supporting innovation, better protection of intellectual property. I'm sure that you know the details and the problems with programs far better than I do. But the things I've read about the Quiero Estudiar program sound really, really impressive as part of starting to tap into the potential that so far has not been met here. And I understand that Colciencias is planning new programs for study abroad that will open opportunities for larger communities within Colombia. I guess I would hope people would set high goals for bringing industry and basic research together to define and to address major needs in the country. I also hope that Colombia won't see the issue as simply addressing development within the country, but rather will also take on the challenge of becoming a leader and guide for the entire region, for scientific education, for collaboration on solutions to common problems. And between Colombia and other countries, I think there's room for many, many opportunities as well. There's the possibility of building networks and collaborations with scientists abroad that are mutually beneficial. This will create synergies that will lead to novel and more rapid solutions to problems. This will also create mutual understanding that goes beyond science. It's very easy for somebody, perhaps like yourselves, to say, good ideas. Someone should do them. And I guess my challenge to you is to have the someone be you. You yourselves can create person-to-person contact. You yourselves can find ways to bring together the scientists and engineers who are trying to solve big problems, and you'll see that collaborations will almost magically happen. You yourselves can help put students together, and the friendships they form will last a lifetime. We're doing this at Cornell. This is a group that came in a couple of years ago, meeting with the president of our university. I don't have a good picture, but this is the group that's there right now, which includes 28 Colombians. In fact, some of you may know some of the people who are at Cornell right now. Anybody know any of the students that have been doing research there this summer? Yeah, I see several hands. And have been having a great time, have been forming a network with very important scientists, a network that can lead to opportunities for further research, opportunities for PhD study. And I wanted to check, I don't have a watch with me, and I don't know how the hour is going. How much time do I have? Anybody? Nobody knows?
You got plenty, don't worry about it.
Plenty? Okay. So I want to tell you, I want to then just, so far I've been giving generalities. Nice generalities, I think, but still generalities. So I want to mention a particular example. Most people, certainly people that I know, when they think about agriculture and they think about the tropics, they think about rainforest or unspoiled habitat, they think it's one or the other. They think either you're going to grow corn and soybeans or you're going to have the jungle. You can't have both. It's incompatible. Human agricultural development and preservation of the rainforest, they can't go together. And so, for example, President Correa of Ecuador believes that and said, all right, if you want me to stay on the right and not on the left, come on. You care about the rainforest? Give me $3 billion. I'll keep it that way. And I want to suggest to you that that's a false dichotomy, that in fact, there are other possibilities. Come on. Oh, first I want to show you what another kind of consequence that can happen. If there is simple development of the land, either for farming or for cattle, you can end up with land that neither supports rainforest nor supports cattle, land that's degraded and worthless. You can also, with current kinds of farming, you can also get this situation. What are the plants that are down below? They're all packed tightly together. I expect that the region of Colombia that grows coffee, that there's large areas that look like this. They're all packed tightly together, which means that any kind of insect that affects the coffee, any kind of disease like the rust that affects the coffee, if it gets on one tree, it goes to the others, like that, like that, like that. And suddenly you have problems all over, and you have to start using pesticides, and the pesticides kill the insects that eat the rust, so then you have to start dealing with the rust. With the rust, you have to grow Robustica rather than Arabica because it's more resistant. You just spiral into a whole series of problems. What about this? And I know that many of you are not experts in plants, but what you're seeing here is a mix of useful plants, a mix of coffee trees, banana trees, other kinds of fruit trees, other kinds of products, all of which can be used, and which together, it's called agroforestry. Together, it preserves rainforest, it preserves animal life, it preserves habitat. It's a different approach, and it's being tried in small places in different parts of the world. Colombia has a huge opportunity to be a world leader in devising ways for this to work. And it's interesting that this actually would be a return to the practice that was used by the Maya, and I don't know about indigenous people here, but by the Maya in Central America and southern Mexico, in which a patch of forest would be cut down, corn would be planted, and then there would be a series of succession in which different types of plants would be used, ultimately returning to forest. So there would be a cycle of going all the way from using it for corn through over the next 10, 15, 20 years, going back to forest and then going back to farming again in a way that preserves the land, preserves the animals, and in a way that's different from the kind of farming we do now. As you know, Colombia, one of the huge assets that Colombia has is an immense number of habitats. Colombia could sponsor the research that leads to finding ways to have agriculture and habitat and forest work together. And if Colombia were able to make those discoveries, it's something that could be taken to other parts of the world, both in Latin America and around the globe. And that, in particular, is something that where there would be willing partners in the US and in other places to help make that come together. Colombia has the idealists who believe that we don't have to destroy the land in order to live on it, and that even a campesino is entitled to a good life. I've become friends with Francisco Miranda, who was a former director of Conciencias, and that's something he's talked about many times, how it is that somebody in Western Europe, in Holland, in France, can live on 3 hectares and have a good life. And why is it that that's not possible here? Colombia has the skilled researchers who can find ways for agroforestry to work in multiple habitats. And in this, in adjusting to the effects of climate change, in creating alternative sources of energy, in bioprospecting, Colombia has the opportunity to be a leader and an innovator, both for the country itself and for the world. And in the process, to improve the lives of all its citizens and share the new knowledge throughout the region. Thank you.
Very much. Of course. Creo que tendríamos tiempo para una o dos preguntas, así muy... ¿Sí?
I want to know what is your experience or your opinion with Fulbrighters. Fulbrighters, the people that has the scholarship or had the scholarship.
I think the Fulbright program. I think the Fulbright program has been incredibly visionary and idealistic. I think it's been a huge, huge success, going in both directions. Both Americans coming to foreign countries and people from Colombia going to the U.S. I've become friends with Ann Mason, who until recently was the director here, and I think she's done a fantastic job. I think that as a country like Colombia starts to set priorities, I think they could shape the program. So they could say, we would like to have a larger proportion of Fulbright dollars go for students who are studying agriculture, students who are studying engineering. And with that kind of shaping, perhaps with some money from the Ministry of Education or from Conciencias, I think a program that's an excellent program can be even stronger. And just to go on with that, I think that one of the strengths of the program actually has been that it requires graduates to come back to Colombia. And I think that that's really excellent. Yeah, ultimately the person can go where the best job is. But at least for a few years, they come back and look for opportunities here. And one way in which that whole process could be strengthened would be if Colombia were to put more effort into making sure that people who return with a PhD from the US or from Europe have a job. Mexico has created a program in which returning people are guaranteed a salary for 2 years. They can go to any university they want, and they get paid by the Ministry of Science for 2 years. And during that time, if the person's good, he or she will get a job. And so I think Colombia should do the same thing.
Well, I was wondering if is there any possibility of thinking of try to have public knowledge instead of intellectual property. I mean, why everything has to be patented instead of being public.
I guess the idealist in me agrees with you, and the person who's practical doesn't. If I'm a scientist working on isolating chemicals from plants from Amazonia, why should I do it? Why should I be away from my family? Why should I spend my evenings, my weekends in the lab? I guess the practical part of me says that one reason could be because of the possibility of discovering things that then make my life better by getting some of the royalty money. I wish it was the case that as knowledge is discovered, it could simply be shared. And I think that the compromise is to make a patent system that doesn't last forever, that lasts, 15 years, where the person who makes the discovery does make some money, but ultimately then it becomes something that's available that anyone can have. Okay?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.